Today we are going to be chatting about yarrow. Yarrow, also known as Achillea millefolium. Millefolium, meaning thousand-leaved, is actually because of the leaves themselves, which you can see, hopefully, are very feather-like. And each one of these tiny leaflets, or excuse me, each one of these tiny leaves itself is very deeply cut, very deeply serrated. They each have their own little leaflets as well. And so it's known as the thousand-leaved yarrow. The genus name Achillea comes from Achilles, named after Achilles. And it is said that yarrow was named after him because this was the herb that he used to treat his soldiers' bleeding wounds in the battlefield. This is this idea of yarrow being able to staunch, right, and to help to quell bleeding, excess bleeding. But what's even further interesting about that is that in the stories, as they roll out, Achilles actually learned about this plant from his teacher, Chiron, the greatest of all centaurs. Part of Chiron's story, which is significant to me regarding the archetype of yarrow being the wounded healer's herb, and identifying the herbalist and the aromatic medicine practitioner as the wounded healer. This is the story. So Chiron was playing around one day. I believe the story is with Hercules, and was accidentally shot by Hercules. The wound was so significant that it never healed, and it stood as sort of a constant source of pain for him throughout the course of his life. And it was through this experience of pain, they say, and through this experience of tending to this wound that would never heal, you can imagine the metaphors are building here, that Chiron learned how to help heal and support other people's wounds and other people's pain. A lot of us come to the plants through our own healing journeys, through our own health and wellness challenges. We come to the plants because we have been left with no other options. We've been abandoned, we've been gaslit, we've been shamed, and we come to the plants to find healing for our own lives and our own bodies. And it is through that work, that learning to work with plants to heal ourselves, that we become that much more knowledgeable about holding that space and supporting others in their own healing work as well, just like Chiron did. I see yarrow as a totem herb for all plant medicine people, aromatic medicine practitioners, herbalists, you name it. It is almost a totem, if you will. And it's a totem specifically because of its association as a wound healing herb, but also its association with healers in general. One of the things that makes yarrow hydrosol so cool, and what makes yarrow essential oil so cool, is that most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, when you distill yarrow, it distills bright blue. This is caused by a compound in the essential oil known as camelagine, and camelagine is an incredible anti-inflammatory. And so that definitely, kind of brings to us to the discussion of topical use on the skin. Some people use the essential oil topically for troubled skin, so skin that's sort of congested, and we're going to learn a little bit more about how yarrow is really quite cutting and quite thinning to congested states. And so, skin that's kind of oily and congested and, maybe troubled because it's congested and oily or stuck or stagnant, a little bit of yarrow can be used. It has a really powerful anti-inflammatory action. So it can really help support like the healthy resolution of inflammation on the skin if it doesn't irritate your skin. The hydrosol is wonderful. I mean, I use the hydrosol so much. Oftentimes it's like I've got, in my office in the other building, I've got a bottle that sits right by my computer. So in between clients, when I'm just, if I'm flagging a bit or if I'm, just got through a really difficult session or something like that, I can just grab the bottle and I can just spritz the whole area. And I feel cleansed and I feel protected and I feel invigorated, and it's just always there for me. Like, you got this, Erika, you can do this. You can keep going. You've got this. But that being said, when it comes to skincare and like congested skin and troubled skin and things like that, inflammation of the skin, Yarrow hydrosol is really lovely because it's super gentle. And of course, if your skin gets along with it and doesn't irritate your skin, can really help with that congestion and supporting of that wound healing, especially if you've got. One of the things that Yarrow does really well, as we're going to learn about, is it helps to really staunch discharges. And it helps to thin things out. And so if you've got like really kind of heavy, greasy skin and it's congested and troublesome, Yarrow can really help to kind of keep everything flowing and moving and not stagnate. You can also work with Yarrow as an infused oil. I think it makes an incredible infused oil. This is something that you can do from dried, which is ideal with infused oils. There's only a few outliers when it comes to fresh and using fresh plant material for infused oils. I think that Yarrow does really well as a dried infused oil, and sometimes I'll use an alcohol intermediary, which is sort of an advanced technique, and that really brings a lot of the aromatics into the oil as well. But I will use the Yarrow infused oil for the aromatic medicine purposes of protection, and also for that sort of divine wounded healer / warrior need. And it's a lot less, it's a lot less intense than the essential oil is. Another reason why I use the infused oil, and will also sometimes use the essential oil topically diluted as well, is for massage oil for the legs, for people who have sort of, venous insufficiency, a tendency towards varicose veins, where return circulation from the legs up into the body is very stagnant. Where blood pools in the veins themselves, causing varicosities, etc. And so I, usually suggest a combination of dry skin brushing and oiling the body. And I might use a Yarrow infused oil as a basis for that oiling, just because it adds a little extra toning action to the cardiovascular system, and and the veins in particular. But I'll say this: whether it be the essential oil, the infused oil, or the hydrosol, some people get pretty irritated by Yarrow on the skin. They may have a history of having an Asteraceae plant family allergy, but Yarrow in particular seems to irritate some people. So if you're going to be using Yarrow topically on the skin, it's always best to sort of do like a test patch where you're, just putting a little bit of what you're going to use on the skin and letting it sit there for, a little while and see what the skin does, just to make sure. As I mentioned earlier, Yarrow, in medical astrology, Yarrow is considered an herb of Venus, meaning that it has an affinity for the reproductive system and the urinary system. And I will say that I find this absolutely to be true in my herbal practice and my aromatic medicine practice. I think when it comes to my modern practice, I use Yarrow tea a lot when it comes to things like recurrent UTIs. So these are, and people talk about them being recurrent. I kind of tend to think of them as sort of irritation in the urinary system that's never really resolved. And makes the environment that much more susceptible to being reinfected. And so I think about Yarrow as sort of a tonic astringent, antimicrobial astringent for the mucosa of the genitourinary system, and the urinary system in this case, as it assists in that toning up, can change the terrain or the environment of the urinary system to be able to get ahead of that sort of chronic reinfection cycle. So I use it for that as a tea in particular. When it comes to the reproductive system, there's a very long tradition of use of using Yarrow, usually as a tea, sometimes decocted in wine, to help reduce excessive menstrual bleeding. So if there's flooding involved, if there's, sometimes like, mid-cycle bleeding, these things, Yarrow may be an herb that I would reach for if the underlying cause of those phenomenon has been identified. But interestingly enough, because one of the things we're going to learn about Yarrow is that it does one thing, but it also does the opposite thing, is that in its capacity to sort of quell bleeding, it is also incredibly decongesting to the blood and thinning to the blood. So while it can stop excess bleeding from happening and dry things up, it also has a way of sort of liquefying or thinning out of the blood as well. And so this comes in handy when we're looking at situations, again, looking at the reproductive system, for folks who have really sort of chronically congested, painful periods where there's a lot of clotting, there's a lot of just really intense, uterine contractions, everything feels really full and heavy. I will bring Yarrow in, sort of supporting the menstrual cycle, and I'll usually do that as a tincture. It's really good for, in one way it helps excess bleeding, and the other it helps thin the blood. And so we have this what's called an amphoteric effect. Amphoteric meaning that it does both. There's also, when we're kind of looking at the digestion in particular, there's another way that I use Yarrow quite a lot. And there's quite a tradition of this. In fact, herbalist William Lassassier, he would talk about Yarrow being indicated for folks who have a lot of that damp stagnation in the digestive system that is leading to ulceration and just degradation of the tissues, which might be the case in diverticulosis, irritable bowel syndrome, and also inflammatory bowel diseases like colitis and things like that. In the case of there being pretty significant sort of damp stagnation in, I would say that even in the colon and the small intestine, maybe there's a history of SIBO also. I will use Yarrow as part of a gut healing tea. This would also be the case if the person has a tendency towards looser stools and we're trying to kind of, again, it's excess discharges. We're kind of trying to dry that up a little bit. And the Yarrow being what it is, very tonic, very healing to the mucous membrane so that they're less irritable, and also less susceptible to like leaking lots of fluids into the bowel, which can sometimes be part of the whole IBS loose stool scenario. So it also, that being said, as a tea, it's a bitter herb. Yarrow is bitter, like it's a bitter tasting herb, and the bitter action itself is very stimulating to our digestive secretions. So, all of our pancreatic enzymes, bile from the liver gallbladder axis, saliva even, and we've got bitter receptors all over our body that help with the excretion of from glands all over the body. So it can help really get digestion moving. It can get things moving again and again. It's that sort of anti-stagnation effect that it has. Yarrow reduces excess pitta. And remembering that pitta is really, that is the dosha that is very fiery. So we've got excess pitta, we've got excess heat, right? So really Yarrow really cools this down. And this is exactly what Venus does as well, is that Venus is quite cooling. So it cools excess pitta, and that also might be showing up as excess bile and inflammation in the gastrointestinal system. So it really cools down excess bile flow. It's that staunching, it's that cooling, and also any sort of inflammation or irritability in the digestive mucosa. It strengthens the mucous membranes. And then when it comes to the effect of all of that, then promoting kind of clarity and like clarity of perception. So it clears the head, it clears the eyes, and that's a bit of a kind of a gut-brain connection. Another way that I use Yarrow, this as a tea mostly, is as a part of a formula I learned when I was in school. And it's called the Epi tea, which stands for elderflower, peppermint, and Yarrow. EPY, Epi tea. And it's equal parts elderflower, not the berry, the flower, peppermint, and it's like mint, but peppermint in particular, and Yarrow, equal parts, and that you drink this as while you have a cold or a flu to help bring comfort, but it also helps the body get through that viral infection efficiently. And so It's the diaphoretic action. So this is like gently heating the internal body temperature up enough for it to be non-inhabitable for the virus, and then you sweat, right? So your body heats up, it cooks the virus, you sweat it out. So yarrow can help with this process. And in fact, that there is a long and important tradition of use for supporting the fever process. Back when, there were, before what we know as modern medicine, fevers and, acute illnesses were really sort of the mainstay of medicine. It's like, that's what everyone was dealing with. And so, supporting the fever, it was a learned skill, because at first in Western medicine, they thought that the fever was bad and that you had to suppress it. But learning how to support a fever safely so it doesn't get too hot, but it still allows for the body to do what it needs to do, was a real skill. And so yarrow was one of those herbs that was used as a diaphoretic. With that, I hope that you enjoyed today's plant talk, and I look forward to seeing you all here in the Aromatic Medicine Garden very, very soon.